Those of us who live and who work and who study in the Pioneer Valley have available to us a very rich literary heritage. Both historically and in the present, a number of very talented writers have made this area their home. And we're very fortunate to have with us today one of those writers, Paul Mariani. Paul lives in Montague and teaches at UMass, and is most widely known as a biographer and as a poet. He has published a biography in 1982, I think, of William Carlos Williams, which has been very well received, and has also published in 1982, and there was a reprint in 1983, his most recent book of poetry, Crossing Cocytus, which I hope he's going to read some poems from today. Paul grew up in New York City, got his BA at Manhattan College, his MA at Colgate, and his PhD from the University of New York. In 1963, he visited Amherst to see the home of Emily Dickinson and said that he fell in love with the place. And in 1968, when he got his PhD, accepted a professorship at the University of Massachusetts and has lived here since. Within the last 2 years, he's published 3 books, many essays and poems, and has lectured in many places across the country. He's also garnered numerous honors just within the last couple of years. It's our pleasure to have him with us today, and I ask you to help me welcome Paul Mariani.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I see some faces I recognize out here as I turn around. I want to read some poems from Crossing Cocytus, and then read some poems from a new book that's coming out next year called Prime Mover. A lot of the landscapes deal with places that you may be familiar with: Greenfield, Montague Center, the Sawmill River, Turner's Falls. These are places that I've come to know and come to love in the last 15, 16 years. Another landscape that's very important to me is the landscape of my own youth. When I was a boy and then as a teenager, places like New York City and then later Long Island. I thought I'd start with a few poems from Crossing Cocytus. And the first one I'd like to read is a poem called The Girl Who Learned to Sing in Crow. I'll give you a little background on some of these poems. They might be of interest to you. I am the oldest of 7 children in a working class family. My father was a gas station mechanic, owned a little gas station, and later became a foreman in a day camp in a bus company. And as the oldest, I remember that we didn't have very much power, and not in a working class family of that size, 9 people. But whatever power the boys had, we made sure that we lorded it over the girls. And I look back now to really to the kinds of silences that we, in a sense, imposed upon the women in the family, not even knowing that we were doing this at the time. It's only in retrospect, that is, as we look back, that I realized the opportunities that were actually were lost. And so this poem is to my sister Julie, and it opens with a kind of still life, in which I remember a scene which I must have seen hundreds of times, and didn't even realize I was looking at it. And it's only after I was married and had my own family that I remember that little house, which is not gone, but it no longer belongs to us. But I still remember looking out of the backyard at early spring, March, early April, when the little flowers would start to grow, and how she would pick the little flowers and put them in a little vase, and just to pretty up the house. And it was a woman's gesture, but one that we didn't recognize at the time. It's only, as I say, in retrospect, that I realize the importance, almost the sacredness of those gestures. So it begins literally with a still life. A still life in two senses. A still life because it is like a painting as I look through the window, but a still life because it no longer has life. Whatever it was is gone. Narcotic plash of water from the kitchen sink. The Easter blue of early morning lifting through the open window behind the sink. Those buttercups plucked by their young and hairy stems from the border along the rusting fence, plucked and grouped together in her own grape jelly glass, placed just so on the worn Formica sill as in a frame. My sister's still life, caught in this tableau gesture of doing once again those breakfast dishes like the little mother she used to think she was, as she sang long and softly, like the solo alto that she might have been at Mass, like in fact a blind canary. How she sang then with all the bright abandon of her 10 and tender years, sang then long and soft and sweetly, though her brothers, toughened and ashamed of so much sweetness, mocked and mimicked her in countersong. Caw, caw. No need at this great distance to rehearse the pressures there to stun and stunt a voice. The truth is that even now I cannot bring myself to put it down on paper. Call it the pock-marked havoc of our growing up. Jesus, call it whatever name you bloody please. It's all behind us anyway, and that voice is riddled through with pain. And which of us will take the blame for the silence which says so well how we treat our women? And who will count the costs? As item, how we mock them for the same courage we ourselves have gasped after each in our locked and airless rooms. As how we sacrifice their hopes to men we sense are stronger than ourselves, slapping back and rump in bawdy fellowship, so that, as sweet day yields to day, we still catch glimpses of a scrawny girl learning how to split her tongue and caw. Hell, we know it happens all the time. We know, just as they do, that it's the songbirds make good eating. One of the things, as you get older, is the realization of how things that when you were younger, you thought they were going to last forever. And nothing lasts forever. In fact, things keep sliding over the edge of the waterfalls like that, irrevocably. And the only thing the poet can do, or the novelist can do, or the writer, or the painter, is to somehow try to hold what is going into the oblivion faster than sometimes you can even hold it. And I remember a few years ago getting a phone call from my father. The first phone call said, your Uncle Vic has died. And then we went down, my brother lives in Holyoke, an old ex-New Yorker like myself, obviously, and we took the car down. And then just less than 3 months later, another call that my Uncle Johnny was gone. And I suddenly realized that the family was shrinking faster than I liked. And, it's that old image, once a year, some families, they gather together. All the cousins and the uncles and the aunts, they gather together. They go to some public park somewhere, or they go to somebody's house if it's large enough, and everybody gets together. And you see your cousins maybe that you haven't seen for a long time. You may not see them again for years. And I noticed at these big celebrations that we have down in Long Island, where most of the family was from, how the old men of the family, my father is the youngest of a family of 11, and 6 of those made it to adulthood. A lot of the other 5 died from various, childhood traumas or diseases, as happened in those days. Pneumonia, it might be smallpox. One died from, another one died by being hit by a truck. But those are the kinds of things that happen, and one of the reasons they had larger families, because you figured they weren't all going to make it, But now, of the 11, there are only 4. And I watched one afternoon, it was in autumn, and I saw suddenly the 4 men who had been gathered together for photographs, suddenly begin to go each their own way to look into the duck pond by themselves. Whatever they were thinking was for themselves. But obviously, it doesn't take too much of an imagination to begin to think of the kinds of things they must be thinking. And so, to celebrate the old men, I wrote this poem called "The Old Men Are Dying." After the 3 days' watch, after the flowers are tossed into a heap, after the last mourner, feeling the coming on of the autumn squall, turns and leaves, the crew comes to seal the boxes, caulking them and screwing the tops down tight to make them seaworthy for the last long voyage. The little boats tug against their moorings until they pull free at last, begin moving then towards the north, a north more north than any the dead pilots have ever sailed before. 2 uncles gone in 3 short months. How the 4 remaining brothers huddle closer together now for warmth against the coming cold. Twice, my brother and myself had to make the trip south from western Massachusetts to New York to pay our last respects. And what was there to say? That the old men were dying. First, Victor, my father's dead sister's husband, short-order cook and journeyman mechanic, his family from Milan, Bertazzo Lapp to Bert. Strokes broke him until he listed badly. One more, and I will not come back, he said, and meant it. When that one hit him, he turned to face the wall, turned north those last 6 weeks until the dark snows swept him up and he was gone, without a word, as he'd been in life. And then John, the burly one, his whole life lived on the same mean street. Mayor of 61st and 1st, the neighbors came to call him, as his little Italy turned to swinging singles paradise all around him. In the old photos, I can see how strong he must have been, so that I do not doubt the tales my father told me of his brother, and for what they're worth, I have passed on to my sons. How once he pinned 2 men to a barroom table by their throats, one with his huge left paw and one with his right. How for years he lifted kegs of prohibition booze and lugged ice boxes 5 flights down to the old Ford van. How he once raised the back end of a Packard while a buddy fixed the flat. It ate him slow, the cancer, ate his stomach first, and then the rest. Leaving his last room late, I walked down the 5 flights of empty waking rooms, saw the unattended open coffins, each with its still pilot waiting to set sail north. And what was there to say? All sorts were there to bid their last goodbyes, those who'd made their mark and those who'd missed. And with the great-grandchildren, all family looks are lost. The blood gets too thinned out. The young enter a world we never knew. Giulia and Giuseppe left Compiano some 90 years ago, settled in New York with 1 million others like them. Their first run down outside their flat at 16 by a drunken iceman who jumped the curb and splotted him. Siciliano, those from the north of Italy shrugged, then turned away. For what was there to do? Once, my father sat on his sister's pine slab coffin, roped to the flat back of the horse-drawn wagon as his family began the long procession across the 59th Street Bridge, headed for Calvary. Too young then to understand, he smiled into the camera. But now even he must feel the cold. You see it when the 4 brothers gather at family picnics, then turn, each one alone, to watch the ducks drifting in the stagnant pond. They stare at the water in the last light of Long Island summer, and though they never talk of it, brace themselves for the time when their little boats will be cut loose, and dressed in their best navy blue two-piece suits, their leathery brown hands folded stiffly right over left with the polished black beads between them, they begin to drift out to the once familiar channels for the last trip north. Okay. The next poem I'd like to read is one that I've been working on. I just wrote it, in fact, less than 2 months ago, and I'm still working on it. But I'd like to try it out today for the first time to an audience. It's a poem about my own youth, which I spent when I was in New York City. And it's dated. It's called New York, Sunday Morning, March 1944. So it's exactly 40 years ago this month. I think that's maybe part of the reason that I was interested in writing it, thinking back to the very beginnings of one's life, to one of the earliest memories I have. Essentially, what the poem is about is a sense of strangeness, coming into a cultural world which, for the first time, and being stunned by it. My own heritage is mixed. My father is of Italian extraction, and my mother of Swedish and Polish extraction. And in the family, you can imagine that the Italian was not spoken because there was only one person who could speak it. But I remember my father taking me in New York City down the streets from 51st Street where we lived and taking me down to 61st Street to Little Italy where he had grown up. And the poem remembers that first shock of recognition of a whole world that was suddenly becoming available to me. And it was also the war. And somehow I did not understand what my father meant when he said that he was about to go off to war. It meant nothing to me. But being in the strange world, something of the darkness that was waiting for me, as it waits for all of us, was already there. And so the poem. I would walk after him into the mist, lifting over 2nd Avenue like some Macy's Day balloon. Accordion iron gates stretched taut across the sunken stores that Sunday morning, the eye lamps of the sullen cars glaring after as I went skip and a half skipping by. For every step my father took, I would take 2, careful not to touch the awful sidewalk cracks between. In my small-peaked camel-colored cap and sailor boy blue coat, I skipped against the veering wind, staring at my shoes as they waded out into the stippled shadow light. I held tight my papa's hand, who was so tall and strong, my giant papa who strode into the frowning laughter of that morning. On and on we went, past the old witch watching from her basement prison window, past gargoyles staring from atop the church cathedral where the hunchback porter waited for the little billy goats to come tripping by. Then underneath the smelly, dripping underpass of the 59th Street Bridge we went until we came again into the sun, blazing bright now above the trembling tenements like a priest-king on his throne. Old men dressed in vests and jackets sat in circles, some on cane-backed broken chairs, some on stoops of crumbling brownstones, all mouthing sounds I could not understand. One squinted, grinning in my face as I watched his yellow, broken teeth. I moved closer to my papa, but the sounds the old men mouthed were tumbling from my papa as they gestured back and forth with hands and faces in their ancient goat-foot dance on the broken Sunday pavement, turning bronzen in the New York sun, become the color of polenta. My papa, who would soon be off to war, had come to say goodbye to the fathers of his youth, and so had brought his boy, his blonde-haired, firstborn, half-Italian son, who stood there cringing by his papa's side in the sunlit world, fast fading before the edge of darkness into which at last he had been summoned. This next poem, a little bit longer, is a poem from my oldest son, Paul, who's now at Harvard. This poem was written, I began writing it about a year ago. I remember going into his room one morning, looking for my razor. And I figured if anybody had it, it was him. And I remember his books on the desk. And I remember that he was preparing for college at that point. And I remember that he had disciplined himself to get up at 4 or 4:30 in the morning so that he could get an early start on the day. And I remember that when I was his age, I had done the same thing, that I'd get up early, sort of like a monk, and begin when the house was still quiet, to get a head start on the day, to get the assignments done as early as possible. And I know that sense that the young, the first time when it suddenly begins to make sense, when it begins to cohere, when all the work that you've been doing in school, all the reading, all those books that the teachers have been telling you, read this, it's good for you, and you say, all right, I guess it is. And then one day, suddenly, the light begins to crash into your head, or hopefully it will, and begins to stream, and you say, oh my God, that's what it's all about. That's what it's all about. That's what they have been trying to say. And I know my son, I could see it in his eye that something had happened, that he was getting up not because he wanted, not because he had to get up, but because he had discovered something. He had discovered something in the words on the page, something somewhere, and that, of course, will remain intimate to him. That will be his secret. But I remember that I had also experienced something like that. And the thing is, I wrote the poem at a very dark time in my own life, at a time when there was no light. And all I could do was try to borrow the light, in a sense, borrow it from my son, because I didn't have it anymore. And so I remember getting up and beginning this poem at 3 o'clock in the morning. I couldn't sleep, and I got up, I went down to the kitchen, and I began to write this poem. Something was troubling me. Something was really bothering me. And all I could think of is the light that I had seen in my son's eyes, so that in a sense, whatever life I had given him, in a sense, he had given me life back. Okay, and it's a sense of that continuum. And so it's called Light Streaming into the Head. When the light trickles through the cracked panel of my son's closed door at 5 a.m., I know he's busy at his books again, the night watchman waiting for his dawn. Last week, once he'd gulped his oatmeal down and driven off to school, I waded through the clutter of his room, searching for a razor. Among the thumbed stack of Spanish words, the strange quadratic symbols, the postcard pictures of the Last Judgment at Autun, and the Parthenon against the pink dawn Eastering, I found his dog-eared paper Bible beside a blood-stiff, crumpled handkerchief, old signs I too well know of hours spent searching in a cell-like room for light to come or come again, while I waited for the niggling words to kindle into flame. I was his age now the first time I think it struck, though I can see how long it was in coming. The way my high school physics textbook showed the motes swarming in the heated air until at last they coalesced and flamed, charged as jagged sheets of lightning to leave the dark forever altered on the stunned mind's eye. But who at first could have told the difference? Another day of classes at Manhattan, the long drive in traffic, and then the long drive back through twilight autumn drizzle in my buddy's hearse gray 57 Ford. Night after night, I would take my dinner on the rebound, then race to make the night shift at the Garden City A&P, stacking Krispies, corn, and apricots along the gaping, hungry rows. Near midnight, I'd be home again, my parents and the younger 6 asleep, ready for another round of wrestling with my books. But this once things were different. By 3 a.m., the tepid instant coffee sloshing at the bottom of my cup, the radiator wheezing in the corner like my old asthmatic dog, and the nosebleeds for the moment staunched. All at once, my head went light when Jowett's Plato gave way to the unexpected music of Ovid's Metamorphoses, the passage where the boyish husband turns in dark to find his dear wife gone, and crawls out into the indifferent shadows after her. Eurydice, Eurydice, the cry of the bereft. And then, whether it was the giddy hour, or because I felt my heart leap at once across some barrier of tongues which no hell I knew could keep me from, my hand reached up and touched the tears forming in the bleary pockets of my eyes, and I felt a light so warm, so very warm and gentle, like nothing I had ever felt before, like a golden river flooding through my head. You know, of course, how all such rivers sink, and soon you are looking for the answer in a blood-streaked handkerchief, and then too many cups of coffee, and then the metal ticking clock. Time then to hit the sack. I staggered to the slanting bathroom sink and looked into the surface of the giddy cabinet mirror and splashed my face and looked again to see the same gaunt, pimply face, the same large nose and lips and stubbled chin, the untamed hair still charged and bristling. Only in the eyes had something changed. And then the still fresh memory of Beacon dying on the sewer-bloated, still majestic Hudson, the sickly river town where I tried to make myself into a priest and failed. And yet once I'd felt a light like this, not in myself, of course, not then, but in the puffy, frog-like eyes of the little German priest whose name I have forgotten, a gentle, self-effacing presence whose tiny, liver-mottled hands had once brushed light across the dusty shelves which housed, he said, his Virgil and his Ovid and that Bunsen-flamed Catullus, until his eyes had flared, brightening the dusty room, and I had stared, wondering where all the light was streaming from. You wait, and then you learn to wait some more. All you can do is turn each empty page, hungry for whatever light there is, as you try to blink back the time when something brilliant flickered blooming in the head. In the meantime, this, that quickening in my own son's eyes, a river, light, a hope, a something, as when Plato's Disney prisoner, as I once heard, neck bent and groping backwards from his cell for air, aware of shadows trailing at his feet, at last looked up to catch full on his face the staggering, honeyed brilliance of the sun. Thank you. Okay, a little bit lighter. I'd like to read a poem about my dog. Some of the faces in here may know this dog. This is my old dog, Sparky. Anybody who walked through town knew this dog. He would come after them. I love this dog. And then one day he disappeared. And you know, you wait, and you figure he's going to come back, and you wait, and you wait, and he didn't come back. And then finally, we all realized, in our own way, my three sons all realized. It's funny, I remember Mark. I remember it was his dog, really, and he was the most stoical of us all. He was the bravest. He just said, "Look, Dad," and he got old, and he just went off. He's a brave dog. He's a stoic dog, and he's like an old Viking, and he just went off, and he doesn't want to come back. He's just gone. And then my wife came home one day. She had bought a little dogwood tree, and she was all muddy. She'd gotten the mud all over her coat and everything, but she wanted to have some kind of memorial, some way of saying goodbye, you know, finally to our dog. And so we had a little service. I wrote the poem, and we planted the dogwood tree. And she didn't know it was a dogwood. I mean, it wasn't a bad pun. It was just, you know, it was just a pretty tree. And we planted it, and then we knew it was over. That, you know, we weren't going to see, you know, we knew that we would never see Sparky again. But many of you have pets, and so I thought I'd read this poem about our dog. And notice I call it Lines I Told Myself I Wouldn't Write. Because for months I said, I'm not going to write a sentimental dog poem. There's no way I'm going to write one of those Hallmark cards. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. But I found a way, I think, finally to deal with this wacky, crazy dog of mine. Nebuchadnezzar, von Hoffman the Great, then Big Sur and Patterson. Instead, since it was really my kid's dog, we settled for Sparky. Better than Killer, I guess. Better than White Fang. An onomastic gesture, if ever there was one. More in line with the Ford pickup sloped to the sides before the town's one beer stop. And what with Argentine conscripts freezing in Darwin and Her Majesty's soldiers leapfrogging the Falklands out of San Carlo, the Belgrano gone and the Sheffield a grave, I promised myself I wouldn't get soft over one flea-bag arthritic half gone in the head when he didn't come home. Springtime, we figured, and the old prune-wrinkled groin bag out after women over in Leverett or up by the lake. But as day followed day, then a week, and then a month, and his cracked, greasy bowl got sacked first by a tomcat and then by 2 cranky jays, there were 3 nights in there when my wife kept waking me up, listening for Sparky with each shift in the wind, the way I remember her doing night after night whenever one of the babies got stuck in his breathing. I know I said I wouldn't go weepy when it came, and I haven't. At least not that much. Besides, half the neighbors must be doing a 2-step. And the kid who delivers the papers and used to fling them into the bushes whenever he heard Sparky can breathe easier now. And last week, a friend put the whole thing in its proper perspective, reminding me how in Taiwan and places like that, they serve them as delicacies. So it's over and done with. The backyard service, the young dogwood planted, except for this dream, where an old dog, battered and nettle-flecked, limps down to the Sawmill River. Across its wide waters, he sniffs till he sees us. And though at first he shudders, he knows he must plunge into that river. When he springs forth, his red coat glistens, his tail whacks back and forth, as in an Aztec mound painting caught in the flickering gleam of the torch. The eyes shift, blend into one. The lips have curled up. The bright eye shines. Okay, you ready for a serious one? One of the things I found myself doing in the last year or so is there's been an awful lot of talk about the bomb, huh? You know, you can't, it's in the papers all the time, the nuclear freeze movements. So I found myself writing several poems about the reality of the bomb and why there's no such thing as, a limited nuclear war. Okay, I mean, if it goes, we're all going to feel it. And I remember talking to a good friend of mine who is a political writer. He's written several essays, many essays, in fact, on the Holocaust, the loss of millions and millions of people, many of them Jews during World War II. And we even use the same phrase. We speak of a nuclear Holocaust, the sense in which whole populations will simply be eliminated within a matter of moments by the bomb. And I was thinking about that. I was thinking about the idea of the sublime. The idea of what kind of transforming language can a poet use in the presence of this kind of desolate reality. And I read this article that Terence gave me. He said, read this article about the whole question, the whole relationship between the idea of a Godhead, or the idea of the sublime, if you will, and the idea of terror. They speak about, in the Bible, they speak about God as being awful or awesome and terrible, okay? This being in the presence of an overwhelming reality. And I feel that even if you don't believe in any kind of a God, you certainly believe in the destructive power of the bomb. I mean, you've seen films, you know what it can do. And so perhaps in one way, you will be aware of what we are capable of doing to ourselves. We have wanted, perhaps for centuries, to become gods. And now we suddenly have the power to do it. At least, if not the power to give life, at least the power to kill. And so I was thinking about this, and I wrote the poem on the sublime. Just a few things in the poem. It begins with a mention of Burke, and I'm thinking of Edmund Burke, the statesman, who wrote about the sublime. That is, what I'm really getting at are figures like Burke, and I'm talking about other figures like Kant. I'm talking about the Reign of Terror that is in France, okay? I'm thinking about earlier images and the way poets in earlier times tried to deal with this overwhelming reality that we have made, that before 1945 was in the imagination, but which is now with us, so we have to live with it now. When Burke stared into the heart of the sublime, his singed eyes flinched at what he saw. Even Longinus had it wrong. Terror was at the heart of it, a sort of noble terror. By way of metaphor, he thought of écartèlement, the flesh torn off and scattered bit by bit, a fitting end to those who tried to tear apart the state. As with us all, it was the ecstasy of suffering attracted Burke. The way the victim's teeth grit on edge, the hair flares out, the forehead puckers like a prune, the eyes roll inward. Then the voice becomes an animal's, a staccato series first of shrieks and then of groans, pain registered in nearly perfect fits. By way of classic balance, he knew terror has the same effect on us, and that so long as we are not the ones dismembered, gives rise to something like delightful terror, a tranquil terror which is but another name for the sublime. In the year the Reign of Terror finally struck, Kant struck back with yet another formulation. By way of metaphor, he chose the raging sea. When the storm drowns us, he said, it washes out our shouts. Waves rise and fall and crash against the cliffs, and lightning shakes our very core. We feel dismembered, bits ready to be swallowed up in death, until the mind itself assumes its demon power and becomes the storm. Consider Turner's painting of the burning of the House of Commons and the House of Lords. In disbelief, the figures clumped together by the river's edge stare like horses trapped in burning stalls as flames embrace them until the frizzled trees, lung scorching air, the Thames itself become the flames on which they stare. The eye stares at the edges of the painter's frame, which cannot hold those all-consuming flames. Gods that we are, we have our own sublime, and stare in terror at the pillar of the cloud, billowing heavenward before our very eyes. Let there be light, we sigh, light brighter than 10,000 suns, and suddenly there is. Okay, another poem. This one is called Irene, Good Night. I don't know, do you know that song, any of you? Good Night, Irene? Okay, yeah. Okay, it's based on that. It's based on that poem, on that song. I remember that, where is it? I remember that, oh, it's down here. Okay, I changed it. Okay. I remember this song when I was a boy. When I was a little boy, when I was 10 and a half, I remember my father used to take me to Scotty's Esso gas station in Mineola to get me out of my mother's hair, I guess is what he did. He's told me I was coming to help out, but there's not that much you can do at 10 and a half years old. At least I couldn't do that much at 10 and a half years old. I could clean the bottles of oil, reconstituted oil. I could, clean up grease. I could put the nuts in one can, and I could put the bolts in another can. But that was about. I wasn't big enough to pump gas or anything yet. But that's what the subject of the poem is. But that's not really what the poem is about. The poem is really. I found myself years later singing this song. You know, I'd be at the kitchen table, you know, or, you know, washing dishes or sweeping the floor, you know, just mowing the lawn, and I'd suddenly begin singing Goodnight Irene. And I said, why? You know, why do we do this? You know, why do we sometimes sing these old songs? Is it, you know, what comes into our head that these snatches of song come up? So I began to examine it. I began, you know, why this particular one? And then it began to hit home. Because then I remember that my father used to sing the song. And that struck me. I said, you know, what is it about the relationship between myself and my father that should think about this particular song? It wasn't just accidental, in other words, okay? So I began to write the poem trying to find out why I was thinking this, you know, what was going on in my own mind. And so that's what the poem is about. The poem really talks about a lot of things. The present in the poem is a boy at the age of 10 and a half. But then, because a lot of time has passed, the boy, the speaker in the poem, can look forward to what happens to that little boy as he grows up. He sees the little boy going to school, high school. He sees the little boy going into the priesthood. He sees the little boy leaving the priesthood and getting married, okay? In other words, he can do that from the perspective of looking back. And then as he begins to examine these images, he realizes that, in fact, a pattern is being repeated. In other words, that he really is, in a way that he did not realize, his father's son. And it has taken him 30 years to realize that, okay? We all have our rebellions when we're younger. We're going to not be like our mothers. We're not going to be like our fathers, right? And as we get older, we get more and more like them, okay? Okay, so this is what the poem is trying to get at. I am 10 and a half, and my father has let me come to work with him again at Scotty's Esso in Mineola, the wood and plaster two-door building 3 blocks east of the pseudo-Bauhaus Boys Catholic High School, from which one day I will venture out to try the priesthood on and fail, knowing it is not for me when I start keeping, against Brother Clyde's injunction, a marker in my physics textbook beside the picture of the lovely in the arm-length cashmere sweater with those swelling upturned breasts. And from beneath the row of fan belts, hanging spider-like, I can see the neon Rheingold sign pulse dully in the doorway of the Colonial Bar and Grill, where 13 years from now, Wilbur will split my upper lip with an ice cube, flung across the smoky underwater room, before my brother Walter can hit him easy with that cross-body block of his, while I reel off my drunky speech to these my friends a week before my marriage. But for now, I am inside the station, listening to my father singing chorus after chorus of, Irene, good night, Irene, I'll see you in my dreams, seeing only part of his face down in the grease pit, the wrench in his clenched right fist, his hooded lamp throwing fitful shadows all across the wall as he performs whatever mysteries it is he does to cars. Useless even to my father, I watch the yellow sunlight blocked in squares drift east across the blackened bench where 2 half-moon brake drums cup the ball-peen hammer as in a wan grease still life, the calendar, gift of Kelly's tires, turned to August, above which the cellophane with a nightie painted on it conceals the underlying mystery of the lady kneeling there who smiles frankly at me. And now the warm smell of leaking kerosene from the thumb-smeared dark green 50-gallon tin as I wipe the opaque blue-green bottles of reconstituted oil for the old baracas, as my father calls them. On the box radio above the wheezy Coke machine, word drones Marines are fighting in a place called Seoul. But there is trouble even closer home, and soon someone is singing once again the song my father also loves to sing, Irene, good night. And I think of Mother back in Levittown, teaching Walter how to read as my sisters go on playing Dolly, the younger one putting her wedding dress on backwards, while I help my father put all the bolts into one coffee can and all the nuts into the other. And now my Uncle Vic, the one the strokes choked off 3 years ago, grabs his grease-clogged rag and mutters as he strides out into the sun to gas up some revved-up Ford, the static gargling high above the engine's macho rumble, while my father goes on working on the underbelly of the car where the light is coming from, singing still again, "Good night, Irene." But my mother's name is not Irene. Her name is Harriet. And I wonder why my father wants to see this other lady in his dreams. But I cannot ask, and will not even know what it is I want to ask, until I am older than he is this August day in 1950. And now the tears well up for him and for my mother and myself as I turn to look back down into the empty pit to tell him now I understand. Okay, a few more. This is a poem for my wife. It's called "The Ring," and if I can find it. And The Ring. You know, years ago, I don't know if they do this kind of thing anymore. When you're going steady with somebody, you give them your fraternity pin, and they give you their high school ring, okay, that kind of thing, right? And that meant you were pinned, okay, whatever. And that's what I'm thinking of here. Now, what had happened was, Eileen had given me her high school ring, and I had given her my pin. She lost my pin, and I lost her ring. And but the marriage has been good. I mean, but I wanted to use that symbol because the poem itself is circular, like a ring, okay? And I wanted to talk about both the sense of what that marriage had been, and in any relationship, the things that we had missed. And so I remember the moment when I was working in a day camp with my father as my foreman, and they needed some sucker to see, every year they like to the boss liked to dress up as the White Ranger, and he would come out in his palomino, and he would come out with a pure white suit and pearl-handled guns. And all the kids would come out and they go, "Oh, look at this, look at this." And then he would ride across on his palomino, and then the bad guys, that was us, because we were, we worked for him, see. So, but somebody had to climb up on top of a bridge, and then he would fire, and we'd fire back, and then he'd tip his hat, and then the guy who was assigned, if he wanted to get paid that week, would get shot, and he'd have to tumble off the bridge into the water, okay? This year my father said, "That's your job." So the thing was, I did it. I stayed underwater, because you have to stay underwater long enough for the kids to think you're really dead. And when I came up, I didn't have the ring on anymore. I had lost it. And so I was finished with the game. I didn't care about the game. I was supposed to stay there and hide. I didn't care. I just wanted the ring. So I ruined it, you see, for everybody. But I kept going back. I went back that night. I went back the next day. I went back. I kept looking in the duck pond for the ring. I could never find it again. But it symbolized something for me. And so I wrote this poem about it called "The Ring." I'd like to read it for you. Only after wading waist deep through the black waters of the duck pond did he feel its absence first. The slight pressure on the small finger of his right hand gone. He would have lost it then in tumbling from the peak of the covered bridge, in the shootout reenactment staged in the brilliant outdoors light for those 700 spellbound day camp kids. He would have lost it in the mud, pushing up for air, the fall and death of the outlaw convincing to the kids and to himself for the minute he was under. Sport enough for a watermelon sort of afternoon, but this was deadly earnest. Forget the macho saga of the West, his boss swinging that pearl-handled gun of his. Forget his foreman father shouting from the stand of willows above the pond to load the garbage truck before the dump in Oceanside closed down. Instead, he turned back to the little pond, scattering the quacking ducks, diving under time and time again to claw at stringy weeds and slimy rocks as he sifted for the little ring. And so, long after the kids and counselors were gone, and night had drifted in, and he had to give it up and tell her, though day by day painting fence or cleaning up the trash. He kept staring at the pond, puzzling where the little thing could be. 20 years and more, and that girl his wife now, and mother of their 3 tall sons, and still it troubles him. That high school ring, Mary Lewis, class of '59, a thing worth maybe $60, if that, at the present gold exchange. An accident, as both of them had come to understand. Forget it, she had said, and that seemed that, except as sign, except as something lost in that mock heroic falling from a height into the duck slime water, a prefigura, a sign circling on itself. He might have shrugged it off, this husband and this dedicated father, after all the mediating years, except, that is, for the bent figure he sees wading wet and cold out into the water with the evening shadows coming on. For the 100th and the 1,000th time, he watches as the figure holds its breath, and he feels his heart begin again to pound as he goes under one more time. His eyes tear, and his fingertips are raw from clawing as he circles still again, searching for the thing he cannot name inside the little ring, which would surely hold the answer if only he could find it. One more. This one is a poem called Then Sings My Soul. It's a poem that was written for a dear friend of mine, Leonardo Rodriguez, a man whom I admire very, very much. When he learned a few years ago that he had cancer, and we were on a retreat. We were on a retreat in January, and I remember he told us on that weekend on the retreat that even though he was a very good man, that he had given up praying. He said he had given up praying because he was afraid that to pray would mean that he would have to listen to what God was telling him, and that God might be telling him that he must die. And there was no way that he could handle that. And so he had simply stopped communicating. And then what happened to him is told in the poem, which is like a story, okay? So I'd like to read this poem to you. Do you know again, this is based on a song as well. It's a religious hymn, Then Sings My Soul. Have any of you ever heard that? Okay. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee, how great thou art, how great thou art. Okay, which is the refrain line for the song. This is the poem. Who can tell a man's real pain, or a woman's either, when they learn the news that they must die? Sure, we all know none of us is going anywhere except in a pine slab box or its fine, expensive equal. But don't we put it off another day, and then another and another, as I suppose we must to cope? And so with Lenny, Leonardo Rodriguez, a man in the old world mold, a Spaniard of great dignity and a fine humility, telling us on this last retreat for men that he had finally given up praying because he didn't want to hear what God might want to tell him now, that he wanted Lenny soon, in spite of the hard facts that he had his kids, his still beautiful wife, and an aged mother to support. I can tell you now, it hit us hard, him telling us, because for me, as for the others, he'd been the model, had been a leader, raised in the old faith of San Juan de la Cruz and Santa Teresa de Avila. This toreador, waving the red flag at death itself, horns lowered and hurling down on him. This story has no ending because there is still life, and life means hope. But on the third day, at the last Mass, we were all sitting in one big circle like something out of Dante. 50 laymen, a priest, a nun, with Guido Di Pietro playing his guitar and singing an old hymn in that tenor voice of his. and all of us joining in at the refrain. Then sings my soul, my Savior, God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. And there I was on Lenny's left, listening to him sing, his voice cracked with resignation. How great thou art, until angry, glad tears began rolling down my face, surprising me. Lord, listen to the sound of my voice. Grant Lenny health and long life, or if not that, whatever strength and peace he needs. His family likewise, and his friends. Grant me, too, the courage to face death when it shall notice me, when I shall still not understand why there is so much sorrow in the world. Teach me to stare down those lowered horns on the dead-end street that shall have no alleys and no open doors, and grant me the courage then to still sing to thee, how great thou art. Thank you very much.